Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Today, we'll be going over how to leverage the Automate database to make your life easier day to day as an MSP. We do have a bit of a mixed audience today, so we're going to start with a little bit of background, and we'll have a live demo showing some of these queries in real time. So without further ado, we'll get started. To get some introductions out of the way, I'm Jeremy, founder of Automation Theory. My firm specializes in MSP tool infrastructure with an emphasis on ConnectWise Automate. Today, we're going to be looking at some of the niche Automate DBA work that we do, but the other side of the Automation Theory shop is protecting your MSP tool stack. Things like your Automate, Screen Connect, Manage, and now Hoodoo and Bitwarden with reverse proxies and WAFs. We have plenty of content about that out on our website if you're interested. So with that introduction out of the way, there are going to be four main categories for what you can do in the database as an MSP. The first one would be monitoring. If you've ever heard of a RAWSQL monitor, that is an internal monitor that's running a SQL query that you provide. And they are one of the most powerful features of Automate. We'll show those in our live demo. The next broad category would be reporting. And there are kind of two aspects to this. The first sense, could be a report center reports proper, but the other component of this would be quick and dirty CSV reporting. If someone comes up to you and asks, hey, can you show me all of the devices across the client base that have option X on them, whether that's software, OS version, fill in the blank, being able to run a quick SQL query and spit out a CSV file can be super time saving compared to manually going through other data sources or trying to reconcile otherwise clunky reports. And you can tuck that query away and then quickly regenerate it and track progress, especially if you're using it for things like tracking is a third-party application patched, which is likely going to be a very common thing over the next few days with the new WebP vulnerabilities coming out. The next major category would be either custom integrations or custom building structure to tie things into your Automate. This too will be included in our live demo. There are a number of scenarios that become a lot easier when you can build out that structure and then tie into it with your monitors or reports or things like that. And last but not least, we'll take a look at some bulk administration inside of Automate. There are certain times where you can either click 20 buttons 100 times, do something on all your clients, or if you can work out the SQL query, it is a one-liner there. Let's take a look at how you would get connected to your Automate database. And there are a few major differences between MySQL and traditional network applications that are important to consider as we get connected. So you're going to have your traditional username and password, but MySQL also has a host, which is the device you're connecting from that is part of the equation. So if you have Bob connecting from his office device, that can be a different account with different permissions than Bob connecting from his home device. You can see the screenshot here. We have the users table from MySQL pulled up, and you can see that there's ASMX labtech 1 and ASMX labtech 2. The host for ASMX labtech 1 is localhost, and ASMX labtech 2 has that percentage sign that is your wildcard character inside of MySQL. That means it can connect from anywhere, but the ASMX labtech 1 can only connect from the local server. Even if you have a working username or password, if you try to connect from something else, it just won't let you authenticate. Most other network applications don't have that. And so that is a common tripping point for people as they're getting connected to their database. Quick note, default port for MySQL is 3306, and that is hard-coded into Automate. That will always be your database port. You should never open that port to the internet. Way back in the day, labtech allowed you to use your desktop control center, and it used to speak MySQL like plain text over the internet, straight back to your database. That feature is thankfully gone at this point, but there are some MSPs, we run into them occasionally, who have their MySQL port open to the internet. So please check this. We ran into one MSP at GeekCon, and they were actually doing a support ticket, doing a rebuild with ConnectWise. That port got opened during that project. It wasn't properly ACLed and never got closed. Even if you know that you have good and tight firewall rules, it's worth validating. The next thing, as we talk about getting connected to MySQL, localhost is a special case. When you specify that localhost is the host you're connecting from, that is the loopback IP address only. So if you have a local IP of 10.10.5.27 and your user is restricted to localhost, you can't connect the local IP, only your loopback address will get you connected. And that is, as mentioned before, a common stumbling block. Last but not least, permissions can be both global and scoped. And if you're adding new users, least privilege is indeed best practice. And where we run into this a lot, it's very popular for MSPs to be using something like Grafana as a dashboarding solution, and they'll go ahead and hook that up to their Automate database. That's all fine and well and good. The question is, does your dashboarding suite need to be able to retire computers or run commands against your agents in Automate? And of course, the answer is no, you don't want that happening. When you create that account, you should likewise think about what permissions does the dashboarding user need and work that out. We have a blog post on our website called How to Pwn an Automate Server. We talk about this more in that blog post. There's an accompanying webinar there. We have a few different blog posts and resources that I'll be mentioning as we go through here. All that will be emailed out to you in the post-webinar follow-up email. So don't worry about trying to hunt things down on our website. You'll get all the links delivered to your inbox. With that, let's move on and take a look at different clients for the database. So now that you can connect, you have a few different choices of what you can connect with. SQL Yog is probably the most common. That is what ConnectWise support uses, and I almost guarantee it's on your Automate server. However, it's not the most powerful client out there. MySQL Workbench is the official client, and most of those paid features in Yog are actually in the free version of Workbench. That's why we recommend Workbench as our client for anyone with an on-prem Automate, and that's what we'll be using for our live demo in a little bit. We also wrote a plugin out there for anyone who has a cloud-hosted Automate server or anyone who's looking to run a quick query. That is Database Commander, and that is a free download out on our website. And last but not least, you can also connect with things like PowerShell for more complex automation and data collection purposes. You can get really creative with that. One thing I did before Automation Theory, I was on the MSP side. I ran an Automate stack of about 10,000 agents. I'm sure lots of people can relate to some internal communications breakdown. And so I went ahead and wrote some PowerShell. It was querying the Automate database for some EDFs I was setting on one side, and it was querying agreements and manage on the other. And it was comparing what does this client buy from us compared to what is being delivered in Automate. So if someone signed a new agreement, let's say they signed on for MDR services, even if there was a little bit of a mishap in communicating that, oh, hey, we should start this deployment project, it would mechanically be caught that there's a discrepancy between what we're selling and what we're delivering. I call that a configuration auditor, and that is one of my favorite use cases for using PowerShell to connect to your Automate database. At this point, we just need to talk a little bit about SQL syntax, and then we can jump into our live demo. So there are going to be 4 main types of statements that you should be aware of when you're getting started with MySQL. Select is, by and large, a read-only statement for getting data out of the database. I don't say it's completely read-only because you can use a select statement to trigger read-write functions like the retire computer function, so it's not 100% foolproof. The other thing you should know is that inefficient select statements can bog down or crash your database, so you don't want to blindly throw any random query that you found out on the internet into your Automate database. And in our demo, we'll look at what is the explain plan for a MySQL query and how to read that and figure out, is this query good, bad, or ugly? The insert statement is how you'd add data into a table in the database, and you provide both the names of the field and the values going into those fields. Update is how you'd modify your existing data. And again, you're providing both the field name and the new value. Then last but not least, delete is how data is removed from your database. The where clause is how you specify the scope of the query. If you look at that delete query on line number 8, if you just ran delete from computers, dropped in a semicolon there, and ran it, it would delete all the computers out of your Automate database. And so that where clause is definitely a requirement unless you're doing some pretty interesting operations there. There are a couple things to note. Queries are ended by a semicolon. Depending on the client you're using, either the pound sign or 2 dashes followed by a space will be your comment character in MySQL. There are a number of rules for names and formats, things like that, but MySQL also has a little bit more flexibility compared to other SQL languages or flavors of SQL you might have used in the past. My wife uses Microsoft SQL for her job, and it is indeed a different beast as far as the syntax there. But you'll notice here on line 4, as we're specifying the field names, that name in the middle is highlighted as a keyword, but that query actually still runs just fine. For anything similar to that, you'd need to enclose it in backticks, but in this case, we can take advantage of the little bit of wiggle room that MySQL affords us, and it correctly parses that query, knowing that the word name is a column name and not a keyword in an operation. Without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump into our live demo. I see we do have one question in the Q&A. The question is that automate to manage PowerShell configuration script available anywhere? Unfortunately, the answer is no. That was something I wrote custom for my former employer. And so I don't have a copy of that. But the big idea is that you'd write PowerShell, you'd connect to the database, and then you'd be looping through certain EDFs. And you'd compare your EDF checkboxes to the agreements that are out there in Manage, and you could do this for really any component of your service delivery, comparing the technical delivery to whatever backend system, and that would go ahead and give you that auditing. From there, you can choose what you want to do with that. Some of the items, like someone who had just started managed services, we'd go ahead and just enable the delivery of the agent behavior there. And for others, we would go ahead and log that out to a ticket and track it down and see like, hey, we see a new agreement for so-and-so, but they're not actually getting the service. Like, has this project just not started yet? Did the agreement get turned on too early? XYZ. Going ahead and moving into our live demo here. Here we are at MySQL Workbench. I'm just getting connected to the Automate database here. I'll go ahead and open a new tab. Just really quick, on the left-hand side here, you'll see a nav menu, and these are the different databases inside of the MySQL server. You can actually have multiple databases. Automate ships with a couple. In theory, you can add additional databases and all of that. So it wouldn't be officially supported, but again, for some of those kind of custom integration things for like importing data, you can write a single SQL query that actually joins 2 tables in 2 separate databases. That is a handy trick, especially if anybody is ever doing any sort of M&A or migrating systems. You can take a CSV export, which we'll show later on, and import that into Automate, either as a table, or you could have a database where you keep all of your custom CSV imports, and then just start to query your 2 data sets and see if things line up or not. So moving along here, The first thing we're going to do is we're going to populate some data in the EDF that we're going to use in our next example for a RAWSQL monitor. We're just going to double check what EDFs we have out there. That is going to be a simple select query. Let's start from extra field. Extra field is where all the definitions are for the EDFs. It uses an ID number. So for the freshly added EDFs that you probably care about for running your queries, by ID ascending, highest to lowest, and we have 514, which is our test script output, and then 515, which will be for our CSV import. 514 is what we care about, and then the actual data, by the way, is in extra field data. All an EDF is an ID number, the extra field ID, and the value. So these ones that are set to 0, by the way, are how default EDFs work. With that, what we're going to simulate here is just a script that writes into an EDF, and that is basically getting data into the database. Automate can do all sorts of deployment of PowerShell or Bash or any other scripting language of your choice and returns the output. So you can scrape almost any piece of data off of an endpoint and get that into the database. And once you can take action on that, you can perform almost any arbitrary action from that data you have. And as I like to say, that is how you start to conquer the world with Automate. We're going to do a basic insert statement here. And we're going to cheat a little bit. We're going to do an insert into select. We'll pull in data from the computers table just to populate that for all of our agents in the database. We're specifying the computer ID, our extra field ID, which is 514, and our value is going to be working in this example. And we're going to select that computer ID from the computers table. We're going to split our computers in half, kind of 50-50, half going to be working, half or not. To do that, we're just going to pull out a silly little mathematical operator that is modulus division. This is going to be for even computer IDs. So where computer ID mod 2 equals 0. Since approximately, now granted, you retire agents and you install them, so you might have a not a precise 50-50 split of even and odd computer ID numbers. This, for our purposes, is going to be good enough to go ahead and populate some data. And then down here at the bottom of Workbench, we can see the query we ran, and it says that there were 2 rows affected, no duplicates and no warnings. We'll go ahead and run the same query, that not equals 2, and we'll set these to be not working. Here we actually have 5 affected rows, so you can see, yeah, it wasn't quite a perfect split, but that's good enough. There's one other use case here that I want to show, and so this is going to be a very strange looking query. But if you're running PowerShell to scrape data off a system and save that into an EDF, occasionally you'll capture an error message in PowerShell. Your SQL queries can span multiple lines, and here we're going to set this value to any computer in the database that has a computer ID that is evenly divisible by 3. And there is 1 device out there. So we updated that value to include this error message, which we'll come back to later as we're building that RAWSQL monitor. Now, let's go out and look at all of our hard-earned data, and then there's one question we'll answer before we start to move into RAWSQL. We'll go ahead and pull in our extra field data, where our ID is equal to 514. And you can see that we have working, not working, and a not working device with an error message here. This is the EDF data we'll base our RAWSQL monitor off of. And we do have one question out in Q&A. And the question is, do you know if you can execute a MySQL query from the Automate REST API? The user here is using Roost with Automate and would love to pull data from the database rather than the REST API. Unfortunately, there's no a way to run a SQL query from the REST API. The goal of a REST API is to go ahead and actually abstract away the database and to make it so you don't need those direct SQL connections. And that is kind of going against the grain of the actual REST API. It's also follow-up comment from Chris. He says for funky inserts, it's always good to use parameterized queries. And that brings us to kind of the other side of the automation theory shop, where if you could run a query from a REST API, that would be a textbook example of SQL injection. In Automate, inside the application, that's a feature. RAWSQL monitors are, as I like to joke, a SQL injection feature. But if you find that you can specify a SQL query inside like a parameter of an API or something like that, that would be a actual security flaw in the application that should definitely be reported. That gets us caught up on Q&A. So let's dive into building a RAWSQL monitor. I'm trying as much as possible to go ahead and type out the SQL queries here in real time, just kind of work through them. But one thing I will copy and paste, this is the base for a RAWSQL monitor. And there's a button up here. You can toggle wrapping. All these panes are actually adjustable. So this god-awful blob of SQL is the base for a RAWSQL monitor. You actually can't find that on the ConnectWise website anymore. I got sick at the end of last week. I was going to put together a PDF one-pager with all these queries and all that, and didn't have it ready for today's webinar, but that will be added to the resources section of our website. And out there, you can actually find our schema docs. We have arguably one of the most up-to-date Automate schemas that you can find, and that is also out there under that resources tab. One thing that we can take a look at here, when you do get a big blob of SQL like this, back to queries you might find out on MSP Geek or elsewhere on the internet, how do you kind of make heads or tails of what it's doing? In Workbench, there is this Beautify button, and you can click it, and it will basically do formatting on that query. It becomes a lot easier to read in the blob of SQL. So you can see it's selecting these columns from these tables, and there's no additional where condition or anything like that. So if we just go ahead and run this query, this returns all 7 agents on this Automate instance. This is the base, and if you return these columns in an internal monitor, it will go ahead and alert for you. On the internal monitor is a correctly formatted SQL query. Once you learn how to massage the SQL to make it bend to your will, that gets pretty interesting. Moving along in our example here, we want to alert on all these devices that go ahead and are, well, not working. To go ahead and lock onto those, leave that semicolon temporarily. What we want to do is we want to go ahead and add a where clause. First things first, though, we need to go ahead and specify the computer ID, because that's what we'll be pulling out of that extra data field. If you remember the 3 columns, we've got the value, the extra field ID, and the value. So the ID field is either the client or the location or the computer that the extra data field is set for. We want computers, and we're going to write what we call a subquery, which is another query inside of parentheses. We want to select ID from extra field data where value is equal to not working. If we go ahead and run that, we go ahead and we get the 4 devices there. One thing that I'll go ahead and point out, the syntax here is table.fieldName. If you pull out, I was actually meaning to show the error, you do this, you get an error that the computer ID in the subquery is ambiguous. Basically what that means, computers has a computer ID column, and some of these other tables like agent computer data also has a computer ID column. And so when you're joining multiple tables that have duplicate column names, for example, clients have a name, and locations have a name, and computers have a name. And so if you join those 3 tables and said, I want to select name from computers, join locations, join clients. The database needs to know which name column you're talking about, what table. Basically, if you see that error, it's a decently common one. That's how you get around that. Next, you'll see here that our test value is actually the computer ID. Normally, you're going to want that test value to be some actual data about the alert, whether that is the actual returned value from the string, like working or not working, or the event ID or description, or whatever bit of data that you actually want to end up in the ticket or passed to your autofix script. And so, to do that, we want to go ahead and join the table to pull in that field. What we'll do is over here, the syntax is kind of crunchy, but we've joined this table here. So we'll just sneak in another join after that. And then what we'll do, see if you can spot the problem here. We're going to join field data on computers that computer ID equals field data.id. This query should run, and we'll run it. We'll actually go ahead and set field data.value as our test value. Here you can see the problem with how we joined that table. All of a sudden, we have 8 rows returned. And so we have duplicate data, and this is some other EDF. This actually isn't what we're looking for. When we did that join, we didn't update the where clause. That can go ahead and throw you for a loop. Also, the order in which you join your tables can impact this. We're starting with the computers table, then we're joining from there, and that's how most of your monitors are going to work. If you're writing RAWSQL for yourself, my main suggestion is to join the largest table first, and that really helps query efficiency and just kind of getting the mindset as far as how you're going to structure your query. You can write it in a number of ways, but thinking, well, it's not necessarily efficient to use the event logs table for queries, it is still handy if you have your event logs turned on. And in the past, I would do it. When I would go ahead and write those queries, I'd be selecting the values from event logs, then joining the computers and locations, and then writing the where clause. So where the event log.computer ID is in, and then your either event IDs or parsing out the message. Later on, we'll show the query profiler, and that will give you a better idea about query efficiency, and you can use that to kind of be your guide as you write SQL for how efficient it is. But for our case here, we'll finish off this query. So we'll set that with field ID 514, and voila, we're back to our 4 not working devices. Now, you might recall that we earlier put in this guy, which is our PowerShell error. So if we're strictly looking for just the output that we know is bad, we're not going to catch it. If you're like me and you like to do some lazy error handling in your scripts, which may or may not be the best practice, but when you're, doing front lines MSP work and things are going a mile a minute, sometimes you have to make some sacrifices, and sometimes error handling is that sacrifice. If you would rather get a ticket with your PowerShell error message and then have someone ping you and say, hey, I got this funky looking ticket, and actually see the error versus never know that your script isn't actually working the way you want it to, what we can do is we can just flip that around, and we can return the value of anything that is not working. And that gives us the PowerShell error message. This might look a little strange when Service Desk gets a ticket with this and someone will ping you, but you'll know that there's an error, which is a lot better than a silent failure, you coming back 6 months later and then realizing, oh, hey, this was never actually working. We have another question in Q&A, which is furthering the discussion about can you run SQL through the API. That's a mention that you could probably execute a script through the API that runs an execute SQL command and then returns the results to you. Yes, you absolutely could. There are other things you can go ahead and do. I wouldn't recommend it, but there are development libraries and frameworks out there where you feed it a database schema and then it creates for you a REST API. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it just for the security concerns, what have you. It's kind of an off-the-wall type thing, but you could create your own third-party API that can read and write into every table of the Automate database, and then hook that up to Roost, assuming you had the ability to do a custom API. And that would just be your kind of custom data fetcher. Again, that is not necessarily a foolproof or super secure approach, but it is within the realm of possibility. And that actually is a nice transitioning point to custom integrations. These days, it seems like almost everything is being delivered as an agent that you install on a local computer. So you probably have a lot of agents to install and a lot of site ID tokens, whether that is for EDR, MDR products, DNS filtering, normal endpoint software. Almost everything is going that way. You probably have a lot of tokens that you need to manage. If you're onboarding a new product or something like that, you have a lot of new clients. That is a lot of copying and pasting and can be a little bit error prone. You miss one character and then the installs don't work, and it can be kind of tricky to figure out that, oh, hey, the client is there, but it isn't phoning home properly and all that. To help with such things, we can go ahead and import data into custom tables. Give you an idea here. Here in my NFR environment, we've got two clients. There is Automation Theory, and then there is the Agent Lab. What we can go ahead and do is we can import from a CSV file, which I'd remind you is a text file with commas with a new extension. I was debating actually creating the CSV file live, but that is not what you're here for. You can right-click any table in MySQL Workbench and hit the Table Data Import Wizard, and I have CSV file out on my desktop. We're going to create a new table, and we're just going to call this token import. Arguably, you could drop the table if it exists, if you've done this import a couple times, refreshing your data source, things like that. We'll go ahead and go through and click next. So there's the client and the token, and it's going to set these to text. If any of these were numbers or any other values, you could go ahead and do that. Of course, you can alter the table structure after it's done. So we'll just go ahead and click next. Next, it imported our data, and voila, we're done. So now we can go ahead and do from import. And oh, you probably hear me on my buckle spring keyboard hitting the shortcut a lot. Control Enter is the hotkey to run the query that your cursor is above in Workbench. And that is the same thing as the little kind of lightning button with the cursor. The other button will run everything in your open editing tab. With that, you can see that we have our clients by name and then the token value. If you log into Web UI for something like the example that comes to mind for me is Umbrella DNS filter, you can export all of your tokens, and then you'll probably have the client names if you synced from another integration, something like that. You might need to manually fix a little data, but soon enough, you'll get matching data that you can go ahead and do. To show this here, we'll go ahead and do select from our token import table, and we'll join clients table. I am missing a from keyword here. Just real quick on joins. If you've ever looked at diagrams of SQL joins on the internet, it's enough to kind of make your head hurt. That's also one of the reasons why I like to think about my tables from the kind of data I want in the biggest table down to the additional tables. It kind of makes it clear how you'd want to write that query. So I want everything from my token import table, and I want to pull in the client data, and I want to match the names. So that join right there, it will match the client based on name. The client ID is the primary key, and that's a good option if you have it. But for example, you can join on the wrong field and start to get things that look really weird. Like you could join on zip code. The database, if you have multiple clients in the same zip code, it would pick a random client and match that to your other client data, basically on a whim. And you probably wouldn't do that. But if you are creating a report, running some queries, and your data is looking just super strange, that's probably a sign that it's joining on the wrong column. we'll go ahead and we'll run this query, and we get, since we did a select star, we get all of the columns from our token import table, and then all of the columns from the clients table. So at this point, we want to get this data into an EDF that we can use in our script, our deployment script for this software. Arguably, you could leave it in the custom table, and you could go ahead and just tell the script to go ahead and do a SQL lookup in all of that. It depends on your particular use cases. Keeping the data in a custom table, it's kind of out of sight and out of mind from the main Automate application. So if you're trying to keep the sensitive automation away from the interns, that's a great way to do it. On the flip side, it can be kind of hard to troubleshoot and work through if you're ever out on PTO or something like that, and somebody is trying to troubleshoot why this script isn't working. An extra table somewhere isn't exactly obvious. If someone's trying to spot check, like, hey, what's the token? Somebody underwent a merger or name change or something like that, you need to update that value. It's a lot easier to edit an EDF than to log into the database server, fire up the client, find the table, and then manually edit the values. You can go either way on that. The other thing to note is that permissions on tables are assigned basically per user by Automate. So if you are trying to use a custom table like this for reporting or something like that, you might get a strange error in Automate. We have another free plugin out on our website that is called Database Permissioner, and it hooks into the normal permissioning cycle that the application does, and it will apply access permissions to your custom tables and views out in the database. And so if you wanted this table to be visible in a data view or in the report center, you'd load up that plugin, pop in the table name, and then the permissions you wanted everyone else to have. Jumping back into our EDF, it's going to be very similar to the query before, where we're going to do an insert select. I'm going to insert into field data. So we're going to select client ID. That will be the ID column in that table. So 515 is the extra field ID number of this client level EDF. And we want the token value to be the value of the EDF. And we're going to select that from token import, a token, join on clients based on the name. There's an error in MySQL syntax. I put in an extra comma after token. That does not need to be there. Okay, so we'll go ahead and hit enter. It says 2 rows affected. And I actually do have Automate opened up here. So just to show this off, we can pop into Automation Theory, go into the Info tab, and here is our widget license key populated in that EDF. And if we pop over to our agent lab, we can go ahead and look at our extra fields and our test script output. This agent number 32,396, that is an even computer ID number. So that got our working value. And if we go back and look at an odd numbered agent, and I'm not showing my ID numbers, but this was my original old Automate server, go into extra data fields, you can see that this odd computer ID is not working. That is how this looks inside of the application. There are no questions in Q&A at this point, so we'll keep moving on to some bulk application administration. So for anybody who doesn't know, there is a fun little feature known as SQL Spy in the dashboard settings. That is a SQL query viewer. I forget off the top of my head what screen it is on. Play SQL queries, we'll hit save, and voila, here is SQL Spy. It shows you in real time just as all these SQL queries fly by. So if we move over here and go ahead and change clients, you can see the different queries and all that. This is super handy for figuring out as you're clicking through the application, like, oh, hey, what is this save button doing? But there is one important note, and that is the tile interface inside of Automate, that's using the REST API. And so you might only get half the SQL for what you're trying to do. But I'm guessing most folks on the call today are admins of Automate. You're probably doing a lot of administrative work in the backend, whether that is renaming groups or some other kind of tedious thing. Our example today is a little bit more straightforward. It only impacts one table, and that is one thing to watch out for. I was working on an R&D project yesterday of inserting some just placeholder data into the patching table to kind of call off some monitors that trigger for devices that have installed patches. When I inserted my dummy data, I broke the UI for showing the patch job history. I have not quite figured that out yet. It's ultimately like another table that's been joined that doesn't have a reference to my dummy patch job. So take heed with certain backend maintenance items. But for me, I was the only Automate admin for about 10,000 agents. So I either had to automate things quick or drown under a flood of different just random needs that had to be done. So in our example today, we're going to set all the devices into maintenance mode. This is a kind of common request for us. We do automate server migrations for MSPs out there. And normally we get about half to 3/4 of the way through the migration project. And it's like, oh, it'd be real nice to not have an alert flood when the stack starts back up. So lucky for us, the application is offline mid-server move, but we can do that completely in the database. First things first, we need to get a grip on the maintenance mode queue table. On maintenance mode, you can see there in the little autocomplete pop-out, that's red. That's a view these days. It used to be a table, and then ConnectWise changed how the backend worked. And to make sure that the queries didn't break, they changed the table to a view. Now, that may not be best practice from a DBA point of view, but for not breaking your queries, I appreciate where they're coming from. If you have any old queries trying to write into that, well, guess what? Not going to work anymore. All that to say, your database customizations should be stable for a long, long time, but if there are ever any schema changes, they might come back to bite you. You can contact your account manager and get an NFR license and get a development automate server, just like the one we're working on today, capped at 25 agents, but it is handy for testing patches, customization, and any wild crazy scripts. We're looking at the maintenance mode queue table. Inserting data into this is how you get devices into maintenance mode. So we want to use our old friend, the insert select statement. The QID is the primary key of the table. For reference, if you're ever wondering what a table structure looks like, here we have maintenance mode queue, and you can hit table inspector, and you can go over into columns. The QID you can see over here is the auto increment. Just like computer ID, when a computer signs up, installs the agent, it doesn't say, hey, I want to be computer ID number 6. It's just whatever number is next in the database. So we don't need to set a value for QID. So we're just going to select an empty string. So that's going to be null. ID, so we're going to join the computers table, time start. I want that to be now. Duration, that's going to be in minutes. So we'll go 60 minutes. Mode, we're going to hit 3. What's really handy is if you put a computer into maintenance mode, and then you can actually have a live example in this table. When you set maintenance mode, it'll ask you, do you want it to be for alerts and scripts or both? So you get 1, 2, 3 as your options. So 3 would be both. User ID is going to be me, but -1 is root. And then comments, I always like to put just something in here for the reason of deleting it back out. And so we'll call this demo. And we'll go ahead, enter. That didn't work because I didn't finish the query. We're selecting from computer. Okay, so 7 rows affected, 7 warnings, integer value for QID. So it basically says, hey, you're trying to put an empty string into a number, and you can't do that. But notice it was a warning and not an error. It actually let us do it. Automate. If you've ever seen the line item in your config file, inodb strict mode equals 0, that turns off the strict mode for inodb, and you can write basically sloppy queries like this. So that's just how Automate works from the vintage it was created. I, as a DBA, might be a query snob. For practical purposes, these queries work, and it's easy enough to just look at the table and then write this out. So if we look back in our maintenance mode queue, you can see everything is in maintenance mode. And if we go back out and go look at all clients and go look at our flags, you can see that everything is in maintenance mode. That is one example of bulk administration. And you can actually do a lot more with that, especially with like onboarding and offboarding. At one point, it was important for clients in office. This was pre-COVID, remote work, all that. We really wanted to get Wake on LAN working, how Automate does that. It chooses from the location. So all those locations need to be devices in the same subnet just because of Automate weirdness. And so I actually wrote a crazy script plus internal monitor, and I let my Automate create and delete its own locations at will and then move agents between them based on their subnet mask and IP address. To that kind of certain degree, it became self-aware, and it was super fun. You can do a lot, but obviously thoroughly test scope your changes and gradually build up your skill level with SQL. It's kind of like a surgeon scalpel, very, very powerful. You can do a lot of good with it. You can also accidentally fall on it and cause severe trauma. Moving on here, let's review a query execution plan and some efficient queries. For this, asking out an MSP geek, thank you to everyone who provided the query and actually installed the integration so it works. So this is a WebRoot default monitor looking for the WebRoot endpoint not being installed. We got a ticket a little under a year ago from an MSP and they were basically down. MySQL was sitting at 100% CPU usage, which is almost always inefficient queries. We were trying to figure out what was running and what was causing the problem, and it was this query. So inside of Workbench, there's this little magnifying glass on top of the lightning bolt, and that executes the explain command. And I'll click this button up here in the corner to close that bottom pane, and we'll drag this up so you can see it. It creates this nice little chart explaining how the query executes. This reads, it is color-coded, green is good, red is bad, yellow is in between, blue is also good. That's not in here, but down here you see full table scans. Full table scan, that is the worst possible option here. And you can see in the notes in that little hint, it's very high for large tables, not so much for small ones. Obviously, this is a development server with 7 agents. I'm not going to have the type of performance issues that a normal MSP would with thousands of agents out there in Automate. But full table scan, that is the worst possible outcome here. And primary key lookups, these are what we're after. Blue is constant, which is also good. Your primary key, by the way, is stored in your buffer pool. MySQL can join and leverage that data without needing to query any of the table data on disk. And full table scan, it needs to read every single thing in that table. It's not hitting an index. So it's like looking through the dictionary start to end, looking for a specific word. Imagine if the dictionary was not alphabetized. That's how inefficient this is. This is basically how you'd kind of go through and see what a query is doing. You know, you find something out on MSP Geek, whether it's a monitor or cleanup script or something like that, you can run the explain button. Please note, just with the select statement, it is almost always read-only, but if you tell it to run the explain plan on like retire computer, it actually is going to try and run that function. Yes, it will actually retire a computer if you do that. Again, just be mindful of that. To show you how we would go ahead and actually take care of a problem query, we'll pull out another one. And this is the workspace data tile relations. This is like if you set like favorite tiles in the UI and go ahead and save that. And pro tip, the desktop client will load faster if you have fewer tiles, especially if you take off the tiles that have intense SQL processing required on the backend, which are going to be your processes and services, along with any other large amount of tables with large amounts of data or anything that's going to have multiple entries per computer. You can see here that we're doing a full table scan on workspace permissions. So to go ahead and do this, I'm actually going to pull out an index out of our index packs. This is another free download on our website. So we'll go ahead and we'll create this index. And the index is, if we show our little output there, see it created that index. And then if we go ahead and run our execution plan, you can see that, hey, it turned green. We're doing a key lookup off of the index. And the index is probably going to be stored in your buffer pool. Not always. That depends on the particulars, and we won't get into that deep of detail in today's webinar. But this is how you would use an index. There's a little bit of nuance to how indexes work and how the database uses them. There's some resources online out there, but for anybody who doesn't have our index packs, I would definitely suggest downloading those, importing that, and starting there. It can be a little bit of a clunky process. We can go ahead and help you if you have trouble installing those. Last but not least, before we come back to our last few slides, I want to go ahead and make the note that you can adjust certain variables at runtime. One thing we'll talk about in our closing troubleshooting slides is the slow query log. Turns out by default, having that turned on, you have to take a little bit of a performance hit. So if you get our database tune-up or one of our maintenance plan clients where we tune your config for you, we turn that off. If you're wondering, hey, my server is having some issues. Do I need to actually restart the database and all that? The answer is no. You can do a quick set global +1. Go ahead and execute that just like you would query, and you can see that success, 0 rows affected. And likewise, you can set that back to 0 to turn it off. You can do that with a number of variables at runtime. If you're wondering about our database tuner plugins, that's what those plugins are doing. They're pulling in live data from your database and doing that just super in passing. There are status variables out here in your database, and you can see that it spat out 492 of them. And this tells me everything the database has done since it started. So when we talk about niche DBA services and like the benchmarking that we do as part of our tune-up service, we take exports of this data and we do comparisons with it and actually track like, hey, adjusted for runtime, is the database performing better? Last but not least, since we'll talk about it in some upcoming slides, there is a performance dashboard built into MySQL Workbench. And this is super handy to look at on occasion when your Automate is just running normally, just to get a performance baseline, just to kind of keep an eye on, hey, how many connections are running? How many SQL statements do you have running at any given point in time? And I'd pop in and check that a few times a day just to get a feel for it. Like your 1 p.m. integration sync is going to be a high load use time versus probably an hour before the end of the day, your Automate server might be having a lull. Again, depends on scripts and reports and what your server is doing. But as we talk about troubleshooting a sick or unhealthy database, the first thing we need to know is what is normal? And it can vary between Automate environments. We work with MSPs all the way from 1 and 2 man consulting shops with 300 agents, all the way up to big multi-state international MSPs with 20 plus thousand agents. And so we have a good kind of gut instinct for database behavior and what things should be, but there's no replacing the actual knowledge of, hey, this is your specific environment with how you use the application and your custom production loads, and this is what your database should be doing normally. Knowing is half the battle, as they say. That is all we have for our live demo portion. We'll jump back and wrap up on a few points of maintenance and troubleshooting. And by all means, feel free to use that Q&A box as we go. Quick touching on MySQL security. An attacker could actually take over all the agents via the database. I think we mentioned that earlier. We have the blog and webinar, Pwn and Automate server. You can actually see us do that walkthrough in real time. As a network service, security starts at the network layer for MySQL, and access controls are going to pay the most dividends. For anybody out there who is running a single server Automate where everything is installed all on one server, the gold standard would be closing the network port and having MySQL only listen on the local host. Obviously, if your instance has grown and you have split off MySQL to its own separate server, you do need to have network access from front end to back end. But basic network ACLs and firewall rules are the name of the game here, along with the good fundamentals, least privilege, strong credentials, etc., etc. Remember, at the database layer, there's no MFA, there's no conditional access or fancy security technology XYZ, at least with an Automate box. And so good fundamentals and access controls are the biggest points apart from keeping your Automate server patched. Shifting gears into maintenance here, by and large, MySQL is actually fairly low maintenance, but there are a few things that will keep it running smoothly. What I always like to note here is that problems don't actually come from your data volume, but it's what the database is trying to do with that data. A lot of times, if you have a slow Automate server, you'll get support on the phone and they'll tell you, go delete all this data out of these tables. And that's never the root cause. It's actually more of a band-aid. That's where, as your Automate server grows, you'll start to have some performance heartburn, and that's where the tuning products that we offer come in. We have everything from free indexes all the way up to our plans and plugins and everything in between. We love just talking with people and working through database issues. So if you ever have a question where you're like, hey, I'm at X size and I'm not sure exactly what I need, feel free to open a ticket with us. We'll book a slot and just kind of talk through with you what you need. Is your instance at a size where you need additional tuning or what have you? With that, table optimization is going to be one of the biggest things for MSPs as far as housekeeping that you're going to do yourself. We'll get that query integrated into that PDF handout that will get uploaded to our website. But basically, this is a classic case of like Windows XP era file fragmentation. When you insert data into a table, it's appended to the end of the flat file in the database. And when you delete data out, it's basically flagged to 0, but it creates empty space inside the file. And so as you're like doing a full table scan or something like that, it needs to jump over those chunks in the file, and that creates a big performance slowdown. There's something known as the optimize table command, and that basically rebuilds the table, condenses it, reclaims that empty space. Please note that the optimize function doesn't need an exclusive lock on the table, so you should probably do that after hours just in case. If it takes a while to get that lock, other queries will start to pile up waiting for it to run, and that can make Automate slow and laggy and maybe crash, and you don't want that during business production hours. The next thing is to spot check the slow query log, and that can be an occasional thing. If there's a query that runs slowly every once in a while, it's generally not the end of the world. If you have a big monthly report for certain clients that runs early in the morning, that just querying all that history, it takes more than your slow query threshold time. It's not an issue so long as it's not impacting your production stability or performance. It's as soon as that kind of bleeds over into day-to-day, you're trying to use Automate, trying to support your clients, and it's sitting here and spinning and not loading, and the desktop client is randomly closing, things like that. It's at that point that you should be trying to track down, are those slow queries or what that actual issue is. Likewise, that baseline system behavior, like we talked about during the demo, knowing what the system should be doing compared to what it's doing now is invaluable. And last but not least, Automate takes nightly backups. Please make sure that they work. Those end up in the program files folder of the application server. And you can actually run into issues where it takes the backup, but the version of MySQL dump is wrong, or it's missing a couple DLLs. And so that's an empty file. You should probably, when we're done here, just spot check that on your Automate server. Because in the last week and a half, I've heard from 5 partners who have had database crashes and needed rebuilds. ConnectWise support is going to try and use those backups. We'll talk about that next on the troubleshooting slide. But if those backups are bad, then you might be in for a surprise. The other thing to know about backups in MySQL is that you have data in your buffer pool. And so if your backup software of choice is doing disk-only snapshots, if you restore from that, you're going to restore the database into a dirty, corrupt state because it's missing the data in memory. MySQL has state awareness mechanisms, and it's going to realize that potentially several gigs of data that were in the buffer pool are missing, and you're going to have a perhaps better but still corrupted database that you'll need to rebuild from that backup. With that, let's move along to some troubleshooting. The error log is going to be the gold standard of figuring out what's wrong with your SQL server. And a log viewer like Clog is going to be the most useful for processing these big log files. These can be upwards of a couple gig, and Notepad chokes at about a 30 meg file. So log viewers can do live tails of files like this. Super, super handy. In the event of corruption issues, like if you start to see assertion failures or similar messages in the logs, while you could try and fight through it, a dump and reload is going to be probably required, and it will be the fastest way to go ahead and get your database back online. There's a variable you can set in your config file called inodb force recovery, and you can set values 1 through 6. The idea is that you start at 1 and slowly work your way up, basically to force the database to start and work and whatnot. It starts to delete data and chop out the corrupt parts. And so sometimes you can find the documentation online of what levels do what. So sometimes I'll see a certain error in the log and know that we need to start at level X. But by and large, it's a little bit of a song and dance to start at 1, try and start the service, see if it crashes, bump it up, try again till you get it. But once you go ahead and find the working value, your database will start up in read-only mode. There's built-in export options into MySQL Workbench, and there are instructions online for dumping and reloading MySQL. That's the way to do it. Automate support really likes to use the nightly backups. The problem with that is, let's say your database crashes at noon. Well, your backup is from 3 a.m. And so all of the work you did that day up until this point, or if it crashes during the midnight nightly maintenance, you're almost going to lose 24 hours worth of agent installs, script edits, and various things your scripts are doing. So if you think about any script that should only run once in an environment. Maybe you're deploying GPOs out in Active Directory or making accounts or changing passwords, something like that. And you use an EDF to indicate, hey, this script is already run and doesn't need to be run again. Well, you lose that if you restore from the nightly backup. So it is worth it to try and fight and get your database online to export it just to minimize data loss. At this point, the rest of our time here is open. Let's see. So we have a question. User is trying to go ahead and remove extra data set values and functions from scripts and convert them to SQL, but are running into issues when using now. Basically, there's a date format. There are several date formatting issues. One thing, I don't know if anyone still on the call is from outside the US. Most of those folks, I think, would be catching the recording. But if you're outside of the US, you have oodles of headaches with date formats in MySQL based on how Automate does it versus in European countries, they flip the month and day order. And there have been some very strange bugs in Patch Manager and all that, just with how those dates are there. So trying to go ahead and use that, the now variable, is worthwhile. Otherwise, there are ways to go ahead and format dates inside of MySQL, and that would be worthwhile. Our next question is, what's the best way to verify the nightly backup? My favorite method is the humble text editor. Dig into your Automate server. You'll see a folder under the Automate program files. So it'll be backup, and then you'll see something called table base. And that is the dump from 3 a.m. And you should just go ahead and pop open a few random files. Make sure you see SQL code in them. And if you do, then you are probably fine. Otherwise, if it's like a 0K file, or you see certain files that are emptier, or you see, oh, hey, I actually don't have certain files and tables in there, that's kind of a big tip off that you should go ahead and spot check what's going on there. And that's just running the MySQL dump command on the command line. You can Google for that and kind of just work through it live and see what the actual error is. Let's say that the table is having an issue reading. It won't alert you in the logs anywhere that, oh, hey, this backup is actually incomplete, is invalid, can't be made whole from this. It will just silently continue. The other thing you could do, you could install MySQL on, let's say, your workstation or some other system, and you could just take one of those zip files, copy it over, extract it, and then import it to MySQL Workbench. Just make sure that you can get a working database out of it. You query it, run your favorite monitors, obviously. All the computer/contact will be a while back, but that's also like a great kind of DR failover test. There's a little bit more nuance to it because Automate is a license locked to public IPs, but that is outside the scope of today's webinar. Next question, when making custom tables, is it best practice to name them plugin underscore something? And the answer to that is subjective. Personally, a standard naming convention for your MSP is probably a good idea, just so you know all of the custom tables you have. If someone is trying to step in, do some administration, or the classic, oh, I built that a year ago and it's been working fine, and now there's been an update and I need to go find something, that will be the hard part if you don't have a custom convention. But as far as will Automate touch my custom tables or anything like that, no. You can name it whatever you want, as long as it's not the same thing as the actual application is using. Looks like we do have someone from outside the US, and it is a requirement when you install Automate to set your localization to the US time zone. Where you can run into issues is that your clients are going to be in whatever localization of your native country, and the dates for like patches reported back by the WUA on the actual endpoints can be different. That is always something to watch out for. And there are also time zone tables in MySQL that you can load in to do conversions. You might need to do that and tweak some monitoring to get that to work the way you want it to. Another question here about the table that houses the data for passwords held at the client or the location. They've been trying to figure out how to verify a username password pair being applied to clients and locations. So that's the passwords table. And the password, because the application uses it, it uses a symmetric encryption. And basically, once upon a time, I asked Automate support about this, about, hey, I'm trying to do bulk network probe work and specify credentials, and I needed that password, and I needed to like encrypt it and set the value. So it is encrypted in the table, and to programmatically interact with it, what you can do, you can take that value and update it at SQL into an EDF that in the dashboard, you can hit a tick box like encrypt this EDF, and it uses the same algorithm. And then with an Automate script, you can use the get EDF value, and it will decrypt that value as it pulls it from the EDF. Then you can actually programmatically interact with that. But as far as tracking down where that is, it is the passwords table. Thank you all for coming. I hope you have a great rest of your day. We will talk to you all later.